And I have to say that I'm a little bit disappointed that President Zelensky hasn't yet read the proposal. That was as of a few hours ago. His people love it, but he hasn't. Russia's fine with it. Russia's, Russia, I guess, would rather have the whole country when you think of it. But Russia is, I believe, fine with it, but I'm not sure that Zelensky's fine with it. His people love it, but he hasn't read it. So someday you'll explain that one to me, Jeff.
I don't have an explanation, sir. What's the next step in that?
Raymond, thank you very much. Good job you're doing. Say hello.
Thank you. What would you like to see Sylvester Stallone?
You just watched raw despotism unfold in real time, and you need to understand what exactly happened there, because this is the moment when American foreign policy transmogrified from strategic calculation into authoritarian genuflection before our very eyes. Trump claimed in front of reporters that he's a little bit disappointed that Zelensky hasn't read his peace proposal, while simultaneously asserting his people love it, but he hasn't. And this rhetorical sleight of hand reveals everything you need to know about the neo-colonial violence embedded in this entire diplomatic charade, because what Trump is doing here is constructing a narrative where the victim of imperial aggression becomes the obstinate party, refusing a generous offer when in reality, the 28-point plan would force Kyiv to give up additional territory in the east, cap the size of its military, and agree it will never join NATO, which means Ukraine would be permanently neutered as a sovereign state and left defenseless against future Russian invasions. But wait, because it gets so much worse, and you need to sit with the full horror of what Trump said next when he casually observed Russia would rather have the whole country when you think of it, but Russia is fine with the peace plan, which is an admission so staggering in its implications that it should have detonated like a thermonuclear device across the entire global media landscape, because Trump is literally acknowledging that Putin's ultimate goal remains the complete subjugation of Ukraine, while simultaneously pressuring Zelensky to accept a deal that Putin apparently endorses, and if that doesn't send shivers down your spine, then you fundamentally misunderstand the nature of authoritarian expansionism and the mechanics of appeasement. This is Trump essentially saying, yes, I know the aggressor wants everything, but aren't you grateful he's willing to settle for just most of your country right now? Which represents a moral and strategic catastrophe of such profound dimensions that historians will study this moment as a textbook example of how democracies betray their allies and embolden autocrats through a toxic combination of narcissism and transactional amorality. Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev told reporters he is optimistic about the plan because we feel the Russian position is really being heard. And that should tell you absolutely everything about whose interests are being served here. Because when the Kremlin feels heard and understood while Ukraine faces territorial dismemberment and perpetual vulnerability, then you're not witnessing diplomacy, you're watching civilizational surrender dressed up in the language of pragmatic deal-making. The talks leading to the 28-point peace plan signaled Americans were siding with Russia and acceding to Russian demands, and the plan heavily favors Russia to such an extent that Secretary of State Marco Rubio reportedly told senators it represented a Russian wish list, which means even members of Trump's own administration recognize this diplomatic framework as little more than Moscow's demands laundered through American intermediaries and presented to Ukraine as if they constitute a legitimate peace proposal rather than terms of surrender. The historical parallels here are so obvious and so chilling that they practically scream from every page of 20th century history, because Trump's kowtowing to Putin has appeasement written all over it, and it's triggered the severest disruption of the world order since the Cold War. And we've foreseen this movie before when Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich waving that worthless piece of paper and proclaiming peace in our time while Czechoslovakia was carved up and fed to Hitler's territorial appetite. And the result was not peace but rather the wholesale destruction of European civilization through total war. Ukrainian and Western commentators see appeasement with better branding, and the plan risks being both a national shame and a strategic disaster if it left Ukraine as essentially a vulnerable rump state, stripped of territory, and barred from NATO, because what Trump fails to understand, or more likely doesn't care about, is that authoritarian leaders interpret concessions not as gestures worthy of reciprocity, but as evidence of weakness to be exploited through further aggression. Now let's talk about the specific provisions of this obscene document, because Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk will be recognized as de facto Russian, including by the United States, Kherson and Zaporizhia will be frozen along the line of contact, and Ukrainian forces will withdraw from the part of Donetsk Oblast that they currently control, with this withdrawal zone considered a neutral demilitarized buffer zone, internationally recognized as territory belonging to the Russian Federation. which represents the formal legal consecration of conquest through violence and the explicit American endorsement of the principle that might makes right in international affairs. This isn't just about Ukraine losing territory. It's about the entire post-World War II international legal architecture being dynamited in favor of a return to 19th century great power spheres of influence, where strong nations devour weak ones, while other strong nations look away or actively facilitate the consumption. Trump's public shaming of Zelensky in front of reporters before attending the Kennedy Center honors, which represents such a grotesque juxtaposition of diplomatic intimidation and cultural celebration that it borders on the surreal, reveals the coercive dynamics at play here. Because Trump was critical of Zelensky after negotiators completed 3 days of talks aimed at trying to narrow differences, suggesting the Ukrainian leader is holding up the talks from moving forward, which inverts the moral calculus so completely that the victim becomes the villain, while the architect of aggression and his American enabler position themselves as frustrated peacemakers, stymied by Ukrainian intransigence. This rhetorical inversion serves a specific ideological function by constructing Zelensky as unreasonable and difficult, thereby justifying potential American abandonment of Ukraine as a consequence of Ukrainian obstinacy rather than American betrayal. The power dynamics embedded in Trump's language deserve sustained critical examination, because when he says his people love it but he hasn't read the proposal, Trump is attempting to drive a wedge between Zelensky and his own government officials, creating the impression that Ukraine's leadership is unified in support of capitulation, except for one stubborn president, which may or may not reflect the actual positions of Ukrainian negotiators, but certainly serves Trump's political interest in portraying resistance to the Russian wish list as the idiosyncratic preference of a single individual, rather than the considered position of a nation fighting for its survival. It was unclear exactly which version of the peace plan Trump was referencing, which adds another layer of gaslighting to this entire performance, because Trump is publicly chastising Zelensky for not reading a document when nobody seems entirely certain which iteration of the constantly evolving proposal Trump is even discussing. Behind the scenes, the 28-point plan was developed by Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and advisor, and Steve Witkoff, and you need to understand the significance of Trump deploying these specific individuals as his principal negotiators, because Witkoff and Kushner are most notably involved when Trump wants results regardless of the consequence. Witkoff has been an apologist for Russia and its actions, and it appears Witkoff coached Russia on how to ingratiate itself to Trump, seemingly placing Russian interests above American. Kushner's past diplomacy efforts appear to have enriched him personally, something that does not bode well for the required neutral stance in Russia-Ukraine talks, which raises the absolutely terrifying possibility that American foreign policy is being conducted not in the national interest or even in the interest of global stability, but rather in the personal financial and political interests of the Trump family and their business associates. The European response to this American betrayal illuminates the civilizational fracture now opening across the transatlantic alliance, because, following the publication of the Trump administration's new America First national security strategy that was deeply critical of Europe, there are fears that U.S. interest in Ukraine's nearly 4-year-old defense against Russia's invasion is dwindling, and the Kremlin praised the new national security strategy, saying it aligns closely with Russia's own view of global affairs. The changes correspond in many ways to Russia's vision, and the Kremlin welcomed language about ending the perception of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance, which means Trump has produced a strategic framework that delights Moscow while terrifying America's democratic allies, and if you cannot see the problem with that arrangement, then you've fundamentally abandoned any coherent theory of alliance politics or ideological solidarity among free peoples. Zelensky was forced to rally European support in London, meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who stressed we are still and remain strongly behind Ukraine because we all know that the destiny of this country is the destiny of Europe. And this European solidarity in the face of American abandonment represents a genuine inflection point in post-war history, because for the first time since 1945, European democracies cannot rely on American security guarantees and must contemplate their own strategic autonomy in a world where the United States has become an unreliable partner led by a president who has previously described Putin as a friend and who appears more interested in appeasing autocrats than defending democracies. The Russian military offensive continues unabated throughout these diplomatic theatrics because Putin signaled he sees no reason to make meaningful concessions, and Russia views continued fighting as its strongest alternative to any deal. Russia's best alternative to a negotiated agreement is to keep fighting, and it has been willing to grind on indefinitely, and as long as Moscow believes it can win on the battlefield, it has little incentive to make concessions, which means Trump's peace proposal doesn't actually advance peace. It simply provides diplomatic cover for continued Russian aggression, while Ukraine is simultaneously pressured to accept territorial losses and strategic vulnerability. This represents the worst of all possible outcomes, where Ukraine faces pressure from its supposed ally to capitulate, while Russia faces no meaningful pressure to halt its invasion, creating a dynamic that incentivizes further Russian territorial gains before any agreement is finalized. The sequence of recent events reveals a deliberate pattern of American alignment with Russian interests against Ukrainian sovereignty, because Witkoff and Kushner held 5 hours of talks with Putin in Moscow, after which Trump said their impression was that Putin would like to see the war ended and would like to make a deal, which Trump presented as if this constituted diplomatic progress, when in reality Putin has always been willing to end the war on terms that involve Ukrainian territorial concessions, strategic emasculation, so Trump's negotiators discovered absolutely nothing new except Putin's willingness to accept American facilitation of his war aims. Then these same negotiators met with Ukrainian officials in Florida, and after 3 days of talks, difficult issues remain concerning questions of territory and guarantees, because obviously Ukraine has difficult questions when presented with a plan requiring national dismemberment. The national security implications extend far beyond Ukraine, because Trump wants the Ukraine war to end, mainly because he sees it as an irritant preventing the normalization of U.S.-Russia ties, especially the planned business deals between his entourage and the Kremlin's cronies, which, if true, represents the subordination of American strategic interests and alliance commitments to the private commercial interests of Trump's inner circle, and constitutes corruption of such a monumental scale that it would make the most brazen political machines of the Gilded Age look like models of civic virtue. In negotiations over Ukraine, European officials say Trump's team has positioned the U.S. as an independent arbiter rather than the leading voice of NATO, which abandoned 7 decades of American leadership within the Western alliance and positions the United States as a neutral party broker between a democratic victim and an autocratic aggressor, rather than as the leader of the free world with clear ideological commitments and alliance obligations. The timeline matters here because Trump said he wants Ukraine to accept a new peace deal by Thanksgiving, and the White House wants Kyiv to sign off on a framework by Thursday, with Trump saying in an interview that the deadline is an appropriate time, which reveals the artificial urgency Trump is manufacturing to pressure Ukraine into hasty decisions about its national survival, while it was strongly implied to the Ukrainians that the United States expects them to agree, meaning Trump is wielding the threat of American abandonment as a cudgel to force Ukrainian capitulation. This represents coercive diplomacy directed not at the aggressor but at the victim, which inverts every principle of alliance politics and collective security that has underwritten the liberal international order since its post-war inception. A previous Trump-Zelensky meeting in February 2025 was intended to discuss continued U.S. support for Ukraine, but during its last 10 minutes, Trump and Vance repeatedly criticized Zelensky, at times drowning out his voice, and media outlets described it as an unprecedented public confrontation between an American president and a foreign head of state, followed by the Trump administration suspending the provision of intelligence and military aid to Ukraine for around a week until Zelensky agreed to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire contingent on Russian approval, and as Russia rejected the proposal, the ceasefire did not materialize, which demonstrates Trump's consistent pattern of punishing Ukraine for insufficient compliance with American pressure, while never imposing comparable costs on Russia for its continued aggression. What we're witnessing unfold is nothing less than the complete abandonment of the strategic and moral framework that has governed American foreign policy since Truman and Acheson constructed the post-war order, because Trump is trading American credibility and Ukrainian sovereignty for the ego gratification of positioning himself as a great dealmaker, while Putin secures through American facilitation what he could not secure through military conquest alone, which is international legitimization of territorial theft and the permanent weakening of a neighboring democracy. According to analysts, the 28-point plan seems like it was designed to assist Ukraine's capitulation when the U.S. presented its proposal, which closely resembles a paper Russia submitted to Washington. Its key points including recognition of Russian control over Crimea and Donbass, capping Ukraine's military, and stopping Kyiv's NATO aspirations reflected the Kremlin's long-standing demands, meaning this isn't an American peace plan at all, but rather a Russian blueprint that traveled through Moscow to Washington and back to Kyiv with American endorsement. The casual cruelty of Trump pivoting from berating Zelensky about not reading the proposal to asking about Sylvester Stallone's potential role as a Hollywood ambassador captures something essential about Trump's sociopathic indifference to human suffering, because in Trump's transactional universe, there exists no meaningful distinction between the life and death questions facing a nation under invasion and the trivial celebrity management questions that populate his reality television consciousness. Zelensky is fighting for his nation's survival, and Trump is thinking about Stallone, which represents such a complete absence of moral seriousness that it borders on clinical pathology. The broader geopolitical ramifications cascade outward from Ukraine to every contested space on Earth, because the free world remains silent when Trump threatens Brazil with 50% tariffs, unless it drops the legal case against Bolsonaro, and Canada faces punitive tariffs and the ominous threat of annexation as the 51st state of the USA, while European leaders are convinced that resisting Putin necessitates appeasing Trump, which creates a global dynamic where democracies must choose between defending the international legal order and maintaining access to American security guarantees. This impossible choice represents the weaponization of alliance relationships where Trump leverages American military and economic power not to defend liberal democratic values, but to extract concessions and obeisance from allies while cozying up to autocrats who flatter his vanity and potentially enrich his businesses. Every authoritarian regime on Earth is watching this transpire and drawing the obvious conclusions about American credibility and resolve, because if the United States will abandon Ukraine after years of promises and billions in aid when faced with a president who prioritizes personal relationships with Putin over alliance commitments, then what possible confidence can Taiwan or the Baltic states or any vulnerable democracy have that American security guarantees mean anything beyond the whims of whoever occupies the Oval Office? Putin's ideal scenario would be to keep talking peace with Trump through a series of leisurely summits while Russia continues to press forward on the battlefield, demolishing Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and Trump mentioned the need for a presidential election in Ukraine, thus parroting a Russian attack line on the legitimacy of Zelensky, which means even as Trump claims to pursue peace, he amplifies Russian propaganda designed to delegitimize Ukraine's democratically elected government. The institutional resistance within parts of the American foreign policy establishment reveals how aberrant Trump's approach appears even to many Republicans, because Representative Don Bacon, a Republican from Nebraska, has blasted the plan as a surrender document that lacks moral clarity about Putin, warning it risks rewarding a dictator who has murdered all of his opponents, and other GOP hawks have dismissed the plan as Russia's wish list, accusing Trump of giving Putin too much leverage at the expense of a Democratic ally. But these voices of principle and strategic coherence remain marginalized within a Republican Party that has been thoroughly remade in Trump's image, where personal loyalty to the leader supersedes institutional norms, ideological consistency, or alliance commitments. You need to understand that accepting this framework doesn't bring peace, it guarantees future war, because if Ukraine surrendered this territory to Russia, central Ukraine would be left vulnerable to rapid Russian assaults in the future, and history demonstrates conclusively that appeasing territorial revanchists by ratifying their conquests doesn't satisfy their ambitions, it whets their appetite for further expansion. Chamberlain's failure and the subsequent outbreak of the Second World War after Germany's invasion of Poland are recognized as evidence that appeasement of expansionist nationalists always fails, because such leaders will simply take all that is offered and demand more. And we are watching in real time as Trump recreates the conditions that produced the most catastrophic war in human history, because he lacks either the historical knowledge or the moral imagination to understand that his deal-making instincts catastrophically misfire when applied to existential conflicts between democracy and autocracy. The legal and moral architecture being demolished here extends beyond any single territorial dispute to encompass the entire principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity that has theoretically governed international relations since the United Nations Charter declared that aggressive war represents the supreme international crime, and all parties involved in this conflict will receive full amnesty for their actions during the war and agree not to make any claims or consider any complaints in the future, which means even the systematic war crimes and crimes against humanity that Russian forces have committed throughout Ukraine would be legally immunized in exchange for Putin accepting something less than total Ukrainian capitulation. This represents the explicit abandonment of international humanitarian law and universal jurisdiction over war crimes in favor of great power impunity, where the strong can commit atrocities with the confident expectation that diplomatic expediency will eventually erase legal accountability. What Trump cannot grasp, because his entire worldview is mediated through personal relationships and transactional exchanges, is that this conflict transcends any bilateral dispute between Russia and Ukraine, to implicate the fundamental question of whether the 21st century will be governed by law or by force, whether democracy or autocracy represents the ascendant political model, whether national sovereignty means anything beyond the provisional tolerance of more powerful neighbors. If Trump has not yet realized his vision for the Ukraine war and a new balance of power in Europe, it is simply because Putin is still playing hard to get, which means Putin retains leverage over Trump, through the simple expedient of withholding the deal that Trump desperately craves to validate his self-conception as a master negotiator, and Putin understands this dynamic perfectly, which is why he can extract ever more advantageous terms by simply waiting for Trump to make additional concessions in pursuit of the agreement that will let him claim victory. The humanitarian catastrophe continues uninterrupted throughout these diplomatic charades, because as the 3 days of talks wrapped up, Russian missile drone and shelling attacks overnight and Sunday killed at least 4 people in Ukraine, and Russia keeps fighting while Trump keeps pressuring Zelensky rather than Putin, which reveals whose behavior Trump considers malleable and whose he considers fixed. Trump believes he can bully a democratic leader accountable to his people and dependent on American aid, but cannot or will not confront an autocrat who murders his opponents and invades his neighbors because Trump respects strength even when deployed for monstrous ends while viewing democratic accountability as weakness to be exploited. The contempt embedded in Trump's public performance, where he casually mentions his disappointment that Zelensky hasn't read the proposal, as if this represents a minor oversight, rather than potentially considered rejection of a document requiring national amputation, demonstrates Trump's complete inability to extend imaginative empathy toward a leader facing choices of existential consequence. Zelensky isn't simply reviewing a business contract, he's contemplating whether to accept terms that would leave his nation permanently vulnerable to the imperial power that has spent 3 years attempting to erase Ukraine as an independent state. And Trump treats this civilizational question with all the gravity of a missed memo. This moment will define the Biden-Trump transition period's impact on global order, because the promises and commitments Biden made to Ukraine are being systematically dismantled by his successor in ways that demonstrate American word means nothing beyond the 4 or 8 year electoral cycle, and no vulnerable democracy can plan its defense or structure its society around American partnership when American support evaporates with each change in administration. The damage Trump is inflicting extends beyond Ukraine to encompass American credibility with every ally and partner worldwide, because they all understand that today's sacred commitment becomes tomorrow's abandoned obligation whenever Trump decides that strategic partnership interfere with his personal relationships with authoritarian strongmen who understand how to manipulate his ego and potentially his bank account. We are living through the active deconstruction of American global leadership and the substitution of Trump's personal whims for the institution of foreign policy traditions built across generations by diplomats and strategists who understood that American power derives not simply from military might, but from the credibility of American commitments and the attractiveness of American values, and Trump is squandering both through his public humiliation of Democratic allies and his obsequious courtship of autocratic adversaries. Donald Trump Jr. suggested that Trump could walk away from Ukraine peace efforts, saying, "What's unique about my father is you don't know what he's going to do." And this unpredictability gets marketed as tactical brilliance when in reality, it represents the absence of any coherent strategic framework beyond Trump's moment-to-moment impulses and personal grievances. The historical judgment will be severe and unambiguous because future generations will look back at this moment and ask how the United States allowed a narcissistic authoritarian to betray a democratic ally fighting for survival in order to facilitate the territorial ambitions of an autocratic rival, and the answer will implicate not just Trump, but the entire political and media ecosystem that enabled his ascent and tolerated his offenses against democratic norms and alliance commitments. Right now in real time, as Trump brags that Putin likes his Ukraine deal, we are watching the potential death of the liberal international order, not through sudden catastrophic collapse, but through 1,000 casual betrayals performed by an American president who cannot distinguish between national interests and personal interests, between alliance commitments and real estate transactions, between the defense of freedom and the pursuit of authoritarian approval. This is the fire, and we're all burning.